The black mail-order bride was sent back for being too old, the townsfolk declared with cruel laughter. But the weathered rancher stepped forward through the dust and whispered, "Just be mine." The woman stood dignified amid the mockery, her graying hair and lined face marking her as damaged goods in their eyes. They expected her to crawl back east in shame, another broken promise discarded like yesterday's newspaper. But the silent rancher saw something else, a strength that matched his own desperate need. His calloused hands trembled not from age but from the weight of secrets hidden in his barn, secrets that could cost him everything he'd built on this harsh frontier. The woman's intelligent eyes studied his face, sensing the unspoken truth that lurked beneath his gruff exterior. Will she discover what he's hiding before the town's whispers turn into something far more dangerous? Before we continue, comment where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will publish a story there. The stagecoach wheels ground to a halt in Cedar Ridge, Wyoming, kicking up clouds of dust that settled on everything like judgment itself. Josie Delacroix stepped down with careful dignity, her worn brown dress and weathered traveling bag marking her as someone who had known better days. At 42, her face carried lines of experience that spoke of wisdom rather than youth. The townspeople gathered like vultures drawn to fresh carrion. Their whispers cut through the afternoon air with surgical precision. Too old, not what was promised, a disappointment wrapped in faded calico. Mayor Whitfield cleared his throat and unfolded a letter with theatrical flourish. His voice carried across the dusty main street like a town crier announcing executions. The intended husband had sent his regrets. The woman was not suitable. She would be returned on tomorrow's eastbound stage. Laughter rippled through the crowd like poison spreading through a water well. Mrs. Whitfield led the chorus of cruel amusement, her sharp features twisted into something resembling satisfaction. The other women nodded and clucked their tongues, grateful for entertainment that cost them nothing but compassion. Josie stood motionless in the center of their mockery. Her spine remained straight despite the weight of their scorn. She had faced worse than small-town cruelty. Philadelphia's charity offices had taught her that dignity was something no one could steal, unless she handed it over willingly. The boarding house keeper approached with reluctant charity. One night's lodging before the return journey, payment expected in advance. The coins Josie counted from her threadbare purse represented the last of her hope converted into cold metal. Across the street, Silas Macaulay watched the spectacle unfold from beneath his hat brim. His weathered hands gripped the porch railing of the general store, knuckles white with tension that had nothing to do with the woman's humiliation and everything to do with his own desperate circumstances. At 45, Silas had learned that life rarely offered second chances. His ranch sat 3 miles outside town, prosperous enough to maintain respectability, but isolated enough to hide secrets that grew heavier with each passing day. The townspeople knew him as a widower who kept to himself, a man who bought supplies in quantities that seemed excessive for a bachelor, but who never explained his needs. Judge Harrison emerged from his office, drawn by the commotion like a spider sensing vibrations in his web. His calculating eyes assessed the situation with the cold precision of a man who had built his authority on other people's misfortune. Behind him lurked Sheriff Coleman, a large man whose badge gave weight to the judge's pronouncements. The crowd began to disperse as the entertainment value diminished. Josie gathered her belongings and followed the boarding house keeper toward a building that leaned against its neighbors like a drunk seeking support. Her footsteps echoed on the wooden sidewalk, each sound marking time until her exile began. Thomas Brennan stepped from the shadows of the saloon, his eyes tracking Josie's movement with interest that seemed misplaced for a stranger. His questions to the bartender earlier had focused on families in the area, particularly those with mixed heritage. The arrival of an unexpected woman might complicate matters he had been hired to investigate. Evening settled over Cedar Ridge like a blanket thrown over a birdcage. The boarding house dining room smelled of overcooked beef and resigned dreams. Josie sat alone at a corner table, pushing food around her plate while calculating the cost of failure. Her teaching position in Philadelphia was gone. Her small savings were exhausted. Tomorrow's stagecoach would carry her toward a future that held nothing but charity and shame. The dining room door opened with a soft creak. Silas Macaulay entered, his hat in his hands and uncertainty written across his sun-weathered features. He approached her table with the careful steps of a man walking across thin ice. His proposal came without preamble or poetry. Marriage of convenience, mutual protection, a partnership built on practical needs rather than romantic illusion. He spoke of responsibilities that required a woman's presence, duties he could not manage alone. Josie studied his face for signs of deception or cruelty. She found neither. Instead, she saw something that matched her own desperation, a need that ran deeper than loneliness. His hands showed the honest calluses of hard work. His eyes held secrets, but not malice. The terms were simple. She would have a home and purpose. He would have help with unspecified responsibilities that kept him awake at night. No promises beyond mutual respect and shared burdens. No expectations beyond what practical partnership demanded. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling windows, and reminding them both that winter approached with indifferent certainty. Josie's choices had narrowed to this moment, this man, this offer that came wrapped in mystery. She accepted with a handshake that sealed more than either of them understood. Tomorrow would bring no eastbound stagecoach journey. Instead, it would bring answers to questions she had not yet learned to ask. The wedding would be simple, witnessed by a preacher who asked no questions, and a town that expected nothing good from unusual arrangements. Silas Macaulay had rescued her from public humiliation, but Josie Delacroix sensed that salvation might flow in both directions before their story reached its end. The wedding ceremony lasted 12 minutes in Judge Harrison's cramped office. Josie signed her new name with steady hands, while the judge's wife witnessed with barely concealed disapproval. Silas paid the fee in exact change and guided his new wife toward a wagon loaded with supplies that seemed excessive for two people. The ride to the Macaulay Ranch passed in comfortable silence. Josie observed the landscape with the practiced eye of someone who had learned to read environments for survival. The property stretched farther than expected, with good water and well-maintained fencing that spoke of prosperity rather than desperation. The house stood solid against the Wyoming wind, built from local stone and timber that had weathered several harsh winters. Silas carried her single bag to a room that had clearly been prepared in haste. Clean sheets, fresh water in the basin, and a lock on the inside of the door that spoke of respect for her privacy. Evening brought simple conversation over a dinner that revealed more about her new husband than his earlier words had suggested. The meal portions were generous, the pantry well stocked with supplies that seemed calculated for more than 2 adults. When she commented on his preparedness, Silas deflected with mentions of harsh winters and uncertain supply deliveries. Night settled over the ranch with sounds that city-bred Josie found both foreign and oddly comforting. Cattle lowing in distant pastures, wind through the eaves, and something else that made her pause as she prepared for bed. A soft crying that seemed to come from the direction of the barn. Silas had retired to his own room with polite wishes for her comfort. The house creaked with the settling sounds of old wood adjusting to temperature changes. But the crying came again, faint but unmistakably human and young. Josie slipped from her room and followed the sound across the moonlit yard. The barn door stood slightly ajar, lamplight flickering from within. She pushed inside and climbed toward the loft where hay bales created shadows that could hide secrets. 2 pairs of eyes stared back at her from a nest of blankets. Children, perhaps 8 years old, with the mixed features that marked them as caught between worlds. The boy clutched a wooden horse carved with obvious love. The girl held a rag doll that had seen better days but remained treasured. Their silence spoke of practiced hiding. Their stillness revealed training that no children should need. But their eyes held the desperate hope of young souls who had learned that adults might bring either salvation or destruction. Silas appeared behind her with explanations that tumbled out like water through a broken dam. Maria, his late wife, had been part Lakota. The children were his by blood and law. But territorial authorities had been known to remove mixed-race children from white fathers. Town prejudice made their existence dangerous to his land rights and their own safety. Tommy and Sarah Macaulay had spent 3 years living as ghosts in their own home. Hidden during the day, free only in darkness, educated in secret by a father who feared that discovery would mean losing everything that mattered. Josie knelt beside the makeshift bed and extended her hand with the patience she had learned from years of working with frightened students in Philadelphia's charity schools. Her teaching experience had included children from immigrant families who understood the necessity of invisibility for survival. The memories flooded back as she spoke softly to the twins. Hours spent helping Italian children learn English while hiding their accents from suspicious neighbors. Polish families who practiced their native customs behind locked doors. The careful balance between preservation and assimilation that marked every immigrant community she had served. Sarah was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper as she asked if the new woman would make them go away. Tommy remained silent, but shifted closer when Josie began examining their makeshift classroom. Silas had done his best with basic letters and numbers, but their education had suffered from his necessary caution. The next morning brought practical decisions that would shape their unusual family. Josie established new routines that balanced the children's need for learning with their requirement for concealment. The root cellar became their daytime classroom when visitors might arrive unexpectedly. The barn loft transformed into an evening sanctuary where normal childhood could briefly flourish. Her teaching experience proved invaluable in ways Silas had not anticipated. She understood how to make education feel like play, how to keep children quiet without crushing their spirits, and how to recognize the signs of visitors approaching before they became visible. The children responded to her methods with the hunger of minds long starved for proper instruction. Sarah showed particular aptitude for reading, while Tommy demonstrated mathematical thinking that surpassed his limited formal education. Both possessed the sharp awareness that came from living always on guard. Thomas Brennan's visits to neighboring ranches became more frequent as the weeks passed. His questions grew more specific about families with children, particularly those involving mixed marriages or unusual household arrangements. Mrs. Whitfield's gossip network reported increased government interest in territorial family structures. Josie recognized the signs of mounting pressure from her years navigating Philadelphia's hostile bureaucracies. She began implementing more sophisticated concealment strategies, teaching the children hand signals for absolute silence and creating hiding spaces that could fool casual inspection. The family bond strengthened through shared secrecy and mutual protection. Josie found herself loving these hidden children with fierce intensity that surprised her. Silas watched his new wife transform from desperate stranger to protective mother with growing amazement and affection. But outside, forces were gathering momentum that would soon test every defense they had carefully constructed. Thomas Brennan arrived at the Macaulay Ranch on a Tuesday morning when autumn frost still clung to the fence posts. His official credentials identified him as a territorial land assessor, but his questions focused less on property boundaries and more on household composition. He measured the distance between buildings with the thoroughness of a man mapping escape routes. Josie watched him from the kitchen window while kneading bread with deliberate calm. Her years working alongside Philadelphia lawyers had taught her to recognize when official visits carried unofficial purposes. Brennan's interest in their barn, his casual inquiries about family size, and his pointed observations about supply purchases painted a clear picture of investigation rather than assessment. The children had vanished into the root cellar at the first sound of approaching hoofbeats. Their silence was absolute, trained through years of practice that had become second nature. Sarah clutched her lessons while Tommy held his breath in the darkness below the kitchen floor. They could hear every word through the thin boards that separated them from discovery. Silas answered Brennan's questions with the careful precision of a man who had rehearsed this moment countless times. Yes, he was recently married. No, they had no children yet. The extra supplies were for harsh winter preparation. A reasonable explanation that Brennan noted with skeptical interest. Josie emerged from the kitchen carrying fresh bread that filled the air with domestic normalcy. Her greeting was warm but not overly welcoming, the balance of frontier hospitality without invitation to linger. She had learned in her teaching days how to project authority while appearing submissive, a skill that served her well under Brennan's calculating gaze. The assessment stretched through the morning as Brennan examined outbuildings with methodical attention. His measurements of the barn included the loft where the children had spent countless hidden hours. His questions about livestock numbers didn't match the feed quantities he observed. Every discrepancy went into his leather-bound notebook with the precision of evidence gathering. Mrs. Whitfield arrived that afternoon, leading a delegation of concerned neighbors. Their mission was officially to welcome the new bride, but their eyes cataloged household details with the efficiency of inventory clerks. They noted the amount of laundry hanging on the line, the size of the vegetable garden, and the quantity of preserves visible through the kitchen window. Josie served tea with the gracious competence of someone accustomed to managing difficult social situations. Her conversation revealed just enough personal history to satisfy curiosity, while deflecting questions that probed too deeply. She spoke of her teaching experience in ways that suggested education without threatening the other women's sense of superiority. The visitors examined her mending basket with particular interest. The small clothes mixed among adult garments raised eyebrows and generated whispered speculation. Josie calmly explained that she altered larger garments for practical use, a reasonable economy that failed to fully satisfy their suspicions. Evening brought relief as the last visitor departed, but the damage was already spreading through Cedar Ridge's gossip networks. The Macaulay household had too many signs of hidden occupants. The new wife seemed too competent for someone supposedly desperate enough to marry a stranger. The timing of the marriage coincided suspiciously with increased government interest in mixed families. Judge Harrison received detailed reports from both Brennan and the ladies' welcoming committee. His legal mind processed the implications with cold calculation. Territorial law regarding mixed-race children in white households was clear and harsh. Discovery would mean forfeiture of parental rights and possible loss of property rights for harboring undesirable elements. Sheriff Coleman began making routine patrols that happened to pass the Macaulay Ranch with increasing frequency. His observations added to the growing file of suspicious circumstances. The ranch operated too efficiently for two people. Supply purchases exceeded reasonable household needs. The new wife displayed knowledge and skills that suggested a past more complex than admitted. Josie recognized the tightening circle of investigation from her experience with Philadelphia's immigration authorities. She had seen families destroyed by bureaucratic suspicion and official prejudice. The signs were unmistakable: increased scrutiny, coordinated visits, and the accumulation of evidence that could support predetermined conclusions. Her response drew on lessons learned from helping immigrant families survive hostile official attention. She taught the children more sophisticated hiding techniques, including emergency signals and multiple escape routes. The root cellar received improvements that made it more comfortable for extended concealment. Supply patterns were adjusted to appear more normal for a household of two adults. The family bond deepened under external pressure. Silas watched his wife transform challenges into solutions with growing admiration and affection. Her intelligence complemented his practical knowledge in ways that made their partnership feel natural, despite its unconventional beginning. Tommy and Sarah adapted to increased restrictions with the resilience of children who had never known normal freedom. Their education continued in whispered lessons and silent study that prepared them for a world that demanded both knowledge and invisibility. They called her Mama Josie with the unconscious acceptance of children who needed maternal love more than they needed explanations. But Thomas Brennan's investigation was reaching conclusions that would soon force the family to confront threats beyond their current ability to deflect. His final report was already taking shape in his careful handwriting, documenting evidence that could destroy everything they had built together. The winter winds were beginning to blow across the Wyoming landscape, carrying with them the promise of changes that would test every bond they had forged and every strategy they had developed for survival. Thomas Brennan returned to the Macaulay Ranch on a December morning when frost turned the grass silver and his breath formed clouds in the sharp air. This time he carried no surveying equipment, no official documents about land assessment. His purpose had crystallized into something far more dangerous than bureaucratic investigation. He dismounted at the front porch with the confidence of a man who held winning cards in a high-stakes game. Silas emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag that couldn't disguise the tension in his shoulders. The two men faced each other across a space that measured more than physical distance. Brennan's revelation came without preamble or diplomatic softening. He was not a territorial land assessor. That identity had served its purpose during the investigation phase, but now truth became a weapon more effective than deception. His actual profession was messenger and negotiator, hired by parties with legal claims that superseded current arrangements. The children were listening from their hiding place beneath the kitchen floorboards. Sarah's hand found Tommy's in the darkness, their silent communication perfected through years of necessary concealment. Above them, they could hear their father's voice change from wariness to something approaching desperation. Maria Standing Bear Macaulay had not died without family who remembered her. Her brother, Chief Standing Bear, had spent 3 years searching for the children who carried his sister's blood and his family's future. Tribal law and territorial agreements gave him legal standing that could override Silas's paternal claims under the right circumstances. Josie emerged from the house carrying coffee that no one wanted, but that provided her hands something to do while her mind processed implications that threatened everything they had built together. Her experience with Philadelphia's legal complexities had taught her to recognize when situations moved beyond simple resolution. Brennan explained his employer's position with the detached precision of a man delivering business correspondence. Standing Bear was not seeking revenge or creating difficulties for the sake of conflict. He simply wanted his sister's children returned to the family that could provide them with proper cultural education and tribal protection. The legal framework supported his claims in ways that Silas had not anticipated. Territorial courts often deferred to tribal authority in matters involving mixed heritage, particularly when white fathers could not provide adequate cultural education. The children's hidden existence could be interpreted as evidence of inadequate care rather than protective necessity. Silas's world tilted on its axis as he realized that his careful concealment had created legal vulnerabilities rather than safety. The very secrecy that protected Tommy and Sarah from town prejudice could be used to argue that he was unfit to provide them with proper upbringing. His love for his children had become a weapon that could be turned against him. Standing Bear himself was not present for this initial negotiation. But Brennan painted a picture of a man who combined traditional authority with modern education. He had attended Eastern schools, understood white legal systems, and possessed the political connections to enforce his claims through either territorial or tribal courts. The children would be welcomed into a community where their mixed heritage was celebrated rather than hidden. They would learn languages, customs, and skills that connected them to their mother's people. They would grow up with pride in their identity rather than shame about their existence. Josie listened to these arguments while calculating their devastating accuracy. Her years helping immigrant families had taught her that children caught between cultures often suffered regardless of the love surrounding them. The promise of cultural acceptance carried weight that mere parental devotion could not match, but the implications extended beyond simple custody arrangements. Standing Bear's legal challenge would necessarily expose the children's existence to territorial authorities. The investigation that followed would examine every aspect of their concealment, every decision that had prioritized secrecy over official compliance. Judge Harrison would be forced to rule on matters that touched his deepest prejudices. Sheriff Coleman would need to enforce decisions that could tear apart a family whose only crime was trying to survive in a hostile environment. The town that had already rejected Josie would find new reasons to celebrate the destruction of an arrangement that had never fit their narrow definitions of acceptable. Brennan's deadline was reasonable but inflexible. Standing Bear would arrive within 2 weeks to meet his niece and nephew and begin the legal process of claiming custody. The children would have time to adjust to the idea of leaving the only father they remembered for an uncle who existed only in their mother's stories. Silas's response came from depths of parental desperation that transcended legal technicalities. These were his children, raised with his love, shaped by his sacrifice, protected by his vigilance through years when discovery could have meant losing everything. No distant relative with theoretical claims could understand the bonds forged through shared hardship and mutual devotion. Josie watched her husband's face cycle through emotions that ranged from fury to heartbreak. Her own attachment to Tommy and Sarah had grown beyond her ability to measure or control. The thought of losing them felt like anticipating amputation of essential organs. But beneath the emotional turmoil, her analytical mind was already working on problems that legal confrontation would create for everyone involved. Standing Bear's claims might be legally valid, but their enforcement would destroy more than one family arrangement. The children themselves would become pawns in a conflict between adults who claimed to love them. The winter wind rattled the windows as if nature itself was protesting the coming disruption of their carefully constructed sanctuary. Standing Bear arrived on a January morning that sparkled with fresh snow and crystalline air. He rode with dignity that commanded respect, even from those predisposed to prejudice. His education showed in his bearing. His clothes reflected prosperity rather than primitive stereotypes, and his eyes held the calm authority of someone accustomed to being heard rather than dismissed. Josie had spent sleepless nights preparing for this encounter. Her experience mediating family disputes in Philadelphia's immigrant communities had taught her that successful negotiations required understanding all parties' deepest needs rather than their stated positions. She had arranged the meeting at the ranch rather than in town, creating neutral ground away from hostile witnesses. The children emerged from hiding for the first time in months, blinking like creatures unaccustomed to daylight. Standing Bear's reaction to seeing them was immediate and profound. His composure cracked as he recognized his sister's features in their faces, her mannerisms in their movements, her blood in their cautious dignity. Sarah approached first with the natural curiosity that had survived years of forced concealment. Her resemblance to her mother was unmistakable in the shape of her eyes and the set of her shoulders. Tommy followed more reluctantly, protective instincts inherited from his father, warring with genetic recognition of family connection. Standing Bear knelt to their level, with movements that spoke of experience with children. He spoke words in Lakota that stirred recognition in some buried part of their consciousness. Maria had whispered these same syllables during their earliest years, fragments of lullabies and endearments that had survived in memory despite years of English-only existence. The conversation that followed required all of Josie's diplomatic skills to navigate between competing claims of love and law. Standing Bear's case was compelling in its legal strength and emotional authenticity. He painted pictures of children who would grow up proud of their heritage rather than ashamed of their existence. They would learn skills and stories that connected them to generations of ancestors. They would belong to a community that valued their mixed blood as strength rather than weakness. Silas listened with the growing desperation of a man watching his world disintegrate despite his best efforts to hold it together. Every argument Standing Bear made carried undeniable truth. The children deserved to know their cultural heritage. They needed community acceptance rather than perpetual hiding. They should learn their mother's language and customs before those connections were lost forever. But the legal implications extended beyond simple custody arrangements. Standing Bear's claim would necessarily expose years of concealment to territorial authorities. Judge Harrison would be forced to investigate why the children had been hidden from official records. Sheriff Coleman would need to determine whether laws had been broken in the process of protecting them. Josie recognized the moment when negotiation became possible. Standing Bear's anger was not directed at Silas personally, but at the circumstances that had forced the children into hiding. His grief was for his sister's death and the lost years with her children. His determination came from love rather than vengeance, creating space for solutions that legal confrontation would destroy. Her proposal emerged from understanding gained through years of helping divided families find common ground. The children needed both their father's world and their mother's heritage. Forcing them to choose between identities would damage them regardless of which side prevailed. Integration rather than separation offered the only path that served their best interests. The compromise she suggested honored all parties while protecting the children from becoming weapons in adult conflicts. Tommy and Sarah would continue living primarily with Silas and Josie but spend summers with Standing Bear's family. They would learn both cultures, speak both languages, and grow up understanding themselves as bridges between worlds rather than outcasts from both. Standing Bear's response revealed the wisdom that had made him a respected leader. He recognized that his niece and nephew had formed bonds with their stepmother that were genuine and beneficial. Josie's love for them was evident in every protective gesture, every educational plan, every sacrifice she had made for their welfare. The legal protection this arrangement would require could only come through adoption that recognized all family connections. Standing Bear proposed formally adopting Josie as his sister, creating kinship bonds that would extend tribal protection to the entire family. This would give them standing under both territorial and tribal law that could resist outside interference. The ceremony that followed was simple but profound. Standing Bear spoke words that made Josie part of his family with the same authority that had made the children part of Silas's household. The legal implications were complex but powerful, creating protections that individual claims could not provide. News of the arrangement reached Cedar Ridge within days, carried by Thomas Brennan and confirmed by official documents that no one had expected. The town's reaction was predictably hostile. Judge Harrison called emergency meetings to discuss the implications of tribal law superseding territorial authority. Mrs. Whitfield organized protests against allowing such arrangements to set precedents. But Josie's moment of moral authority came when she addressed the gathered townspeople with the calm dignity that had sustained her through months of concealment and years of prejudice. Her words carried the weight of lived experience and intellectual clarity that could not be dismissed or ignored. She challenged them to consider whether their actions served justice or merely satisfied prejudice. She asked whether children's welfare mattered less than adult comfort with familiar arrangements. She pointed out that their community could choose between becoming known for wisdom or remembered for cruelty. Several townspeople found themselves nodding despite their initial hostility. Her argument was too reasonable to dismiss, her love for the children too obvious to question. 1 year later, the Macaulay Ranch had transformed into something Cedar Ridge had never seen before. The barn that once hid frightened children now echoed with laughter as Tommy and Sarah played freely in its loft. Their voices carried across the yard without fear of discovery or punishment for existing. The kitchen table that had served meals in whispered silence now hosted conversations in 3 languages. Sarah's Lakota was progressing faster than Tommy's, but both children switched between English, their mother's native tongue, and their father's frontier vernacular with the effortless fluency of true bilingual speakers. Standing Bear visited monthly, bringing stories and skills that connected his niece and nephew to their broader heritage. He taught Tommy to carve with tools that had belonged to his grandfather. He showed Sarah beadwork patterns that carried family history in their colors and designs. These lessons happened in daylight now, witnessed by neighbors who had learned to accept what they could not change. The legal protections their unusual family arrangement provided had proven more powerful than anyone anticipated. Territorial authorities found themselves unable to challenge tribal adoptions without risking broader conflicts with native nations. Judge Harrison's attempts to investigate the family's past arrangements had been quietly discouraged by officials who preferred stable peace to legal precedent. Josie's transformation from rejected mail-order bride to respected community mediator had occurred gradually but undeniably. Her intelligence and diplomatic skills had resolved disputes that might otherwise have escalated into violence. Families brought her their problems because she understood how to find solutions that honored everyone's dignity while serving practical needs. Mrs. Whitfield's gossip network still functioned, but its targets had shifted. The woman who had once led cruel laughter at Josie's public humiliation now sought her advice on family matters. The conversion was incomplete and grudging, but it represented progress that would have seemed impossible during those first bitter days. The ranch prospered under management that combined Silas's practical knowledge with Standing Bear's trading connections and Josie's organizational abilities. Their cattle were healthier, their crops more diverse, and their financial position stronger than it had been during the years of hiding and fear. Tommy and Sarah had grown taller and more confident, their personalities emerging from the shadows where fear had once kept them confined. Sarah showed her mother's artistic inclinations combined with her stepmother's intellectual curiosity. Tommy demonstrated mechanical aptitude that impressed his father and tactical thinking that pleased his uncle. The children's education had expanded beyond basic literacy to include subjects that would prepare them for whatever futures they chose. Josie taught them history and literature with the thoroughness of her Philadelphia training. Silas showed them ranching and practical skills essential for frontier survival. Standing Bear provided cultural education that connected them to ancestral wisdom. Their summer visits to the reservation had become celebrations anticipated by both communities. The children served as bridges between worlds that had previously viewed each other with suspicion and hostility. Their comfort in both environments demonstrated possibilities that adults had never considered. The Macaulay family's success had not eliminated prejudice from Cedar Ridge, but it had forced that prejudice to operate in shadows rather than public squares. Open hostility had become socially unacceptable, replaced by grudging tolerance that might eventually evolve into genuine acceptance. Thomas Brennan had departed for other territories after completing his mission, but his final report had noted the family's stability and the children's well-being with professional satisfaction. His work had achieved its intended goal of reuniting separated family members while creating unexpected benefits for everyone involved. Sheriff Coleman's patrols still passed the ranch regularly, but their purpose had shifted from surveillance to neighborly checking. His relationship with Silas had evolved from suspicion to mutual respect, based partly on the family's obvious stability and partly on their contributions to community peace. The winter evening when Josie's greatest test arrived came without warning or fanfare. The stagecoach that pulled into Cedar Ridge carried another rejected mail-order bride, another woman whose age and appearance had disappointed expectations and prompted cruel laughter from assembled townspeople. The scene replayed with painful accuracy. Mayor Whitfield read another rejection letter. Mrs. Bray? Whitfield led another chorus of cruel amusement. The woman stood alone in the center of mockery that echoed across months in memory. But this time, Josie Macaulay stepped forward from the crowd with authority that commanded attention and respect. Her presence changed the dynamic immediately, shifting focus from victim to protector, from entertainment to intervention. Her words were few but carried weight that silenced laughter and transformed cruelty into shame. She offered practical help and human dignity to someone who needed both desperately. Her actions demonstrated the kind of community Cedar Ridge could become if it chose compassion over comfort. Silas watched from across the street with pride that had grown deeper than romantic love. His wife had become the moral center of their community through strength that transformed challenges into opportunities for growth. Her journey from humiliation to leadership had created pathways others could follow toward better versions of themselves. The rejected woman accepted Josie's offer of temporary shelter and guidance. Her story would unfold differently because someone remembered what rejection felt like and chose to offer what had once been denied to her. That evening, the Macaulay family gathered around their kitchen table for dinner that celebrated more than daily sustenance. They had created something unprecedented in their corner of Wyoming territory. A family built on love rather than convention, sustained by wisdom rather than tradition, and strengthened by acceptance rather than exclusion. Their story had become proof that dignity and intelligence could overcome prejudice, and that families could be built on foundations stronger than blood or law alone.